Well, it turns out there are some microorganisms that are eukaryotic instead of prokaryotic. So eukaryotic microorganisms, these do have organelles inside of their cells, and these make up the category that we call the protists. Protists, these are all eukaryotic protists. They're all eukaryotic, and this is just kind of, sometimes it's called a catch-all group of organisms. So these are eukaryotes that don't fit in the animal, plant, or fungi groupings of organisms. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. We're going to see a lot of variety in this section. Let's just make a couple of introductory notes here. So this is a catch-all category that includes eukaryotic cells, includes eukaryotes. They're microscopic, so microorganisms, that word still applies. They are eukaryotes that are not animals. They are not plants, and they are not fungi either. Okay, so what are they? That's what they are not. Let's describe what they are. Okay, so protists, most of them are unicellular, meaning that their entire body is made up of just a single cell. Well, oops, most are unicellular. Okay, we'll see a couple of exceptions to that. Some, in terms of the feeding style, some protists are autotrophs, meaning that they are self-feeders, or they're photosynthetic would be another way to say that. Some are autotrophs, meaning they are photosynthetic. Photosynthetic protists. This makes up the familiar category known as the algae. Algae are photosynthetic protists. So there you have it, algae that grow in swimming pools or other water bodies. It's algae. Algae comes in 3 different varieties, and we'll see some of these later on today. Algae can be unicellular, or they can be colonial, live in colonies, colonial, or there are some that are multicellular. So we'll get to those a little bit later. For now, we're still in the intro notes. Okay, so some protists are photosynthetic or autotrophs. Others are not. Others are heterotrophs, meaning they're not photosynthetic. So for example, we are heterotrophs. We have to ingest food. We have to acquire food from something else. So heterotrophs, these all acquire food from other organisms. Okay. All right, so in terms of that category, the heterotrophic protists, all right, what do they consume? If they're not photosynthetic, what do they consume? Some heterotrophic protists actually eat bacteria. So bacteria, like we just saw in the previous video. Some eat bacteria, or other protists, so they eat other cells. Okay. Some of them, instead of eating other living things, they might just absorb nutrients. Some absorb organic molecules from their surroundings. And then yet others are parasitic. Some are parasitic. Meaning that they take nutrients from another living thing. They don't necessarily kill the other living thing, they just take nutrients from it. Take nutrients from a living host. We will see examples of each of these as we go. Okay, one more. Last bullet for this list. Okay, some heterotrophs use a variety of mechanisms for obtaining their nutrition, so they don't fit in. They don't fit in necessarily just one of these categories. They might fit in a couple of them. So maybe some of the time they eat other bacteria cells, other cells like bacteria or protists, and maybe other times they just absorb organic molecules. So if they utilize a variety of mechanisms like that, they are called mixotrophs. Okay, so some are mixotrophs. Mixotrophs. This means they have a variety of feeding mechanisms, and the ones that we will be seeing, they are capable of both photosynthesis and obtaining nutrients by other means as well. So capable, I'm just going to say they're capable of both photosynthesis and heterotrophy. And so it's making use of both of these categories. Excuse me. All right, so that's kind of interesting. That's a useful thing if it's an organism that only sometimes has exposure to sunlight. Okay, so sometimes maybe it's living in dark conditions, other times there's light available. And so when there's light available, it's useful to be able to photosynthesize, but otherwise it needs to be able to change its nutrition mode. The example that we will be seeing with regards to this is a protist called Euglena. You may have seen Euglena before in high school biology or other places that you may have looked regarding biology materials. Euglena is a well-known protist. Euglena is a good example of a protist that can change its mode of nutrition, depending on light availability, light and nutrient availability in the surroundings, light and nutrients. Okay, so that's a little bit of general information about nutrition for protists. Habitat for protists. Habitat. Okay, so keep in mind these are unicellular things, unicellular organisms for the most part. And with regards to habitat, usually protists need access to water. So many of our protists that we will be seeing are aquatic. Most are aquatic, meaning they live in the water. That could include things like oceans, lakes, or ponds, or swimming pools for algae. Most are aquatic, but there are some that are terrestrial, and that this applies if there is a lot of moisture in the soil. So some are terrestrial if there's moisture available. So for example, damp soil, or a lot of times leaf litter, or if it rains, the leaves do a good job of trapping that moisture. Leaf litter. Okay. And then still with regard to habitat, there are some protists that are what we would call symbionts, meaning they have some type of a symbiotic relationship with something else, and they might actually live on the other organism. So some are symbionts. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that. That's my dishwasher. Some are symbionts. Okay, meaning they live in the bodies of host organisms. All right, so we'll be looking at 4 different sort of informal groupings of protists. Again, we said protists, this is a catch-all group. There's a lot of variety in the protist world. We're going to be going through 4 categories, 4 informal categories of protists. Okay, and just so that we have an idea going into this, what are the 4 headers we're going to be watching out for? We will start with the protozoans. Then we'll move on into the slime molds. And then algae. We'll see some unicellular, some colonial. And then finally, we'll wrap it all up with talking about seaweed. Seaweed is not a plant. Seaweed is an example of a protist. Seaweeds. Okay, so 4 categories. Let's go ahead and get into them. First up, we have the protozoans. All right, the protozoans. All protozoans have to ingest their food, so no photosynthetic organisms in this category. They all ingest their food, and they all live in aquatic environments. So think water bodies, live in aquatic environments. All right, so live in aquatic environments. Examples of protozoans. I will, in our Canvas shell, I will include some pictures there so that you will be able to look at along with this video. So flagellates. Flagellates have flagella, and so these are protozoans that can move. They can kind of swim along, flagellates. Good example of this would be Giardia. It moves with a flagella. Giardia. This is Giardia. This is a parasitic organism, actually. This is one that can cause unpleasant symptoms like diarrhea. It can be obtained from drinking dirty water. Okay, so flagellates, amoebas. Amoebas, I think I've shown you a video of amoebas moving, amoeboid movement. This is where the cells develops a pseudopod, pseudopodia, false feet, and it just kind of slides forward by rearranging its cytoskeleton. Amoebas all move by that characteristic way, move by means of pseudopodia. Okay, and then we've got, next up, apicomplexans. Apicomplexans. All apicomplexans are parasitic. All are parasitic. Plasmodium is a good example of an apicomplexan. Plasmodium is what causes malaria. Plasmodium. Causes malaria. Okay, the name apicomplexan, this is referring to, so apex sort of means on the edge of something or on the surface of something. Apicomplexans, these cells have, so it's a single cell, and on one side it has sort of like a hardened shell on it, and that allows the apicomplexan to bore in to other things. So literally what these do, what Plasmodium does, is it bores its way into a blood cell, and is parasitic on the blood cell. So interesting category there. Finally, for protozoans, last grouping would be the ciliates. Ciliates have cilia. That's why they are named as they are. Some ciliates are heterotrophs, others are mixotrophs. So quite a bit of variety here. Heterotrophs and mixotrophs. Okay, and they all have cilia, which provide movement. Cilia provide movement and help to bring food over near to the cell. Cilia provide movement and sweep food into the mouth, quote unquote, mouth of the cell. It doesn't really have a mouth because it's a single cell, but it's got an area where it brings food inside of the cell body. Okay, an example of a ciliate. If we were doing in-person labs, we would see some of these in person. I'll link some videos or at least pictures for this again in our Canvas shell. Paramecium is an example of a ciliate that is a protozoan. Paramecium is very common in pond water. If you go out and you find like a puddle of water in the ground after it rains, or if you just go to a pond, you are likely to see some paramecium if you look with a microscope. paramecium in pond water. Okay, so let's just pause for a second right here. Already you can see the protists, this section will drive you crazy if you're not careful. The protozoans, it's hard to say like one specific thing that categorizes a protozoan. There's a lot of variety already that we've seen just right here. So I would encourage you pause the video, just take a minute and look back through what did we just say for protozoans. We've got 4 different types of protozoans listed out right here. So give yourself some time to process all this information. Okay, then the slime molds come next. The slime molds are sort of multicellular. In any case, there are multiple cells that live together to make up a slime mold. Multicellular, sort of. It's different kind of multicellularity than what our bodies have. But they are multicellular. Still, we're in the protist category. And what the slime molds do is they feed on dead plant material, and they help to break down dead plant material. So that's a good thing. They're the digesters, one of the digesters. They feed on dead plant material, clean up the environment that way. All right, 2 different types of slime molds. Plasmodial slime molds and cellular slime molds. We'll start with the plasmodial slime molds. Plasmodial slime molds. They are named as they are because they have a plasmodium. What is a plasmodium? A plasmodium is a network of cytoplasm, network of cytoplasm fibers. So imagine, right, the cytoplasm of a cell, stretch it out into a long skinny tube. So you have got a network of those cytoplasm fibers, and they're connected together by nuclei. And this makes an interesting network that is really good for taking in organic materials from the environment. Now let me write some of this down. Plasmodial slime molds, these consist of a network of fine cytoplasm filaments connected with nuclei. You know what, let me squeeze in network of nuclei connected by, that'll make more sense. Nuclei connected by fine cytoplasm filaments. There we go. And what this network does is it allows the uptake of bacteria and dead organic material. So these filaments are capable of taking in bacteria, kind of like a spider web. It traps them and then it absorbs them. Take in bacteria and dead organic matter. Okay, so what the plasmodial slime mold will do is just stay put in one area for a while until it absorbs the organic matter from that location, and then when it runs out of nutrients, it will grow a stalk and produce some spores. Those spores can float off just through the wind and go find another region with organic material to start this whole cycle over again. So when the food runs out, the plasmodial slime mold will grow a reproductive structure, a reproductive stalk, and release spores. Okay, and those spores again can start this whole cycle over again. The other type of slime mold, so this is one, the other is called a cellular slime mold. Cellular slime mold. Cellular slime molds are solitary cells that exist in a feeding stage. So solitary cells, that's why it's called cellular slime molds. Solitary cells in a feeding stage. Okay, so while it's in the feeding stage, we've got sort of independent cells. When the food runs out, what will happen is the cells swarm together into a colony, and that colony form is what produces a reproductive structure, and sort of produces almost the same idea as the plasmodial slime mold, but independent cells exist for most of the time until they need to reproduce. Then they all swarm together. And that happens when the food runs out. Cells swarm together and form a stalked reproductive structure. Okay, here we go. We're getting there. So we've done protozoans, we've done slime molds. Next up, we have algae. So again, this would be a good spot to just pause the video, give yourself a little bit of a mental break, and then let's go on. Let's get through the algae here. Algae come in a couple of different varieties. There are, again, unicellular algae, and then there are colonial algae. We're going to group these together for this heading anyway. Unicellular and colonial algae. All right. Okay, so talking about unicellular algae. These are components of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton floats on the surface of the ocean, so floats on the water, and it's made up of photosynthetic organisms. So these are components of phytoplankton. And what is phytoplankton? Phytoplankton is photosynthetic organisms. Oops, synthetic organisms that float on the water's surface. In the ocean. All right, let's start with the unicellular algae. 3 different examples of unicellular algae. Dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are interesting because each species of dinoflagellate has its own unique shape. It has a very characteristic shape. And that shape is made up of a cellulose plate that surrounds the cell. So that cellulose can be arranged into different sorts of patterns, and this leads to really intricate structures in some cases. Each species has a characteristic shape. And that is due to cellulose exterior plates. So cellulose, that should be familiar from when we talked about photosynthesis. The sugars that plants make get built up into cellulose. This is how plants store sugar. And now here's cellulose again. It's showing up with the dinoflagellates. Okay. And in the dinoflagellates, the cellulose plate is protective. It provides like a shell of protection for the dinoflagellate. In addition to that cellulose exterior, dinoflagellates also have 2 flagella. And those 2 flagella, when the dinoflagellate uses them, it causes a characteristic spinning motion. These 2 flagella cause a spinning motion. Dinoflagellates in the ocean, they partner with coral reefs. And they help to sustain the reef. Partner with corals to sustain the reef. And they are also, last note for dinoflagellates, dinoflagellates are also responsible for causing red tides. If you've heard of red tides or seen pictures of red tides are due to an explosion in the population of dinoflagellates, so population bloom is what causes that. Dinoflagellate population explosion. Okay, and then that can be toxic to certain fish that are in the water. This is because there's suddenly a high accumulation of toxins. Toxins produced by some are poisonous. Okay, end of sentence. All right, so dinoflagellates, that's a unicellular algae. Our next example of a unicellular algae would be the diatoms. Let's see here. Let's underline, this is one heading. Next up, we've got the diatoms. Diatoms. So big difference to just kind of help you keep down what's differentiating these two. Dinoflagellates, we just said they have a cellulose exterior. Diatoms, on the other hand, they're going to have a cell wall, a wall around them that's built of silica, which is just glass. So diatoms all have a glassy wall, glassy cell wall. That's very characteristic of diatoms. Glassy cell walls, they're beautiful. If you look at them in a microscope, glassy cell walls made of silica. Okay. And diatoms, they do something interesting. They store food as oil. So they've got these little oil bodies, and that keeps them floating on top as plankton. So, right, if you mix oil and water together, what does the oil do? It always floats to the surface. So same thing here. The fact that diatoms store food as oil, food stored as oil, this keeps the diatoms, while they're alive, keeps them floating on the surface. Keeps them floating as plankton. Okay. All right. Then we have the green algae. Green algae, actually I'm going to squeeze this one right here. Green algae. Green algae are green because they have chloroplasts. Okay, so same as plants. This is the pigment that green plants have. This is why they look green, is because they have chloroplasts. And green algae are freshwater organisms, so that rather than living in the ocean, they live in fresh water. So they show up in lakes, ponds, aquariums, freshwater aquariums, home pools, green algae. Okay, then we also have, in addition to the unicellular varieties, we also have what are called colonial green algae. Colonial green algae. And a good example of a colonial green algae is Volvox. Volvox. Volvox colony looks really interesting. Volvox is like a hollow ball, and it's full of flagellated cells. So the cells have flagella. Hollow ball of flagellated cells. Okay. All right, so let's just come back up here. Again, we're under the major heading, unicellular and colonial algae. Okay, so these first three, the dinoflagellates, the diatoms, and the green algae, these are unicellular. And then down here, whoops, not sure what happened there. Down here, this last one is colonial. Okay, so mostly we were talking about unicellular algae. Just one example of colonial down here with Volvox. All right, we are nearly there. So last type of protists that we will cover today are the seaweeds. Seaweeds, we're probably all familiar with seaweeds. When you go to the beach, you see seaweed. It's in the ocean, near rocky shores, washes up on the beach. Seaweeds. Seaweeds are protists, so they are not plants. They are instead large, multicellular, marine algae. These are marine algae. Okay, so they're for sure multicellular. That is something to note. This kind of sets these apart from most of the other protists that we have seen. Seaweeds all grow on rocky shores and also just offshore. They have to have some kind of a substrate to hold on to. So mostly that means they're on the shores and just offshore. The cell walls of seaweeds are unusual. They are very slimy. This is very characteristic of seaweeds. Their cell walls are slimy and rubbery. Slimy, rubbery substances. And that's important for the seaweed because that slimy, rubbery coating helps to prevent the cells from experiencing damage. Like they're out in the waves, they're being thrown against the rocks all the time. There has to be something to protect them, and it's this rubbery coating that helps with that. These help cushion against the waves. Seaweeds can be classified based on the pigments that they have, so based on what color they are. Classified based on the pigments that are present in the chloroplasts. So we know how to do this. We know how to work with pigments from chloroplasts. We did a lab on this earlier in the semester. We used a spectrophotometer to measure absorbance. Okay, so the pigments that are present, this leads to a few different types of seaweeds. Green, red, and brown are the common varieties. Green, red, and brown. And the brown algae, these are sometimes known as kelp. Seaweed is something that is useful in food products. This may be used more commonly than you realize. So as food, seaweed is an excellent source of iodine and minerals, which are very important to have in our diets. There's a rich source of iodine and minerals. Okay, and most of us don't just eat seaweed directly. Usually it's included as an ingredient in other things. And what it does in general is provides an interesting flavor and also texture to food products. This is probably the most direct example of using seaweed in food is as the wrapping for sushi. Oftentimes sushi is wrapped in seaweed. So let's see here. Let's list a couple of things. Wrapping, sushi. But then it also is used just as a thickener. It's used as a thickener in puddings. And here's the other one. This is going to probably be a surprise. Ice cream. Ice cream actually has seaweed, or a derivative of seaweed, included in it. Helps to thicken the ice cream. In the lab, we use seaweed as a source for agar. So if you've ever seen a petri dish, it'll have like a layer of gel stuff in the bottom, and that's a good substrate for cells to grow on. So in the lab, this is very useful as a source of agar. Okay, that is it for chapter 15.